73 years old, 18 years of monthly checks, $2.3 million sent, and his only granddaughter was sleeping on a shelter cot with nothing but the clothes on her back. When Conrad Keene finally stood face to face with the young woman he thought was living like a princess, he asked one question that would destroy everything he believed about trust, family, and the people we hand our hearts to. Where did every single dollar go? Before we get into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is a story that will make you question everything you think you know about the people closest to you. It's about a man who thought he was protecting the only piece of his daughter left in this world, and the woman who turned his love into the greatest theft of his life. Conrad Keene wasn't born into wealth. He built it, brick by brick, deal by deal, until his name meant something in Chicago's financial circles. By the time he was 60, his real estate empire stretched across 3 states. Hotels, apartment complexes, commercial properties. He had the kind of money that meant he never had to look at price tags again. But money, as he would learn, can't protect you from the worst kind of pain. The kind that comes when you lose the only person who ever really mattered. Her name was Stephanie Wheeler. His daughter. His world. She had her mother's laugh and his stubborn streak, and when she walked into a room, people noticed. Not because of her father's money. Because of something else. Something real. She met Frank Cook at a charity fundraiser in downtown Chicago, one of those black tie events where people pretend to care about causes while networking for their next business deal. But Frank wasn't there for business. He was a social worker. He made $38,000 a year helping kids in the foster system, and when Stephanie asked him what he did, he told her the truth. He said he spent his days fighting for children nobody else wanted. She fell in love with him that night. Conrad didn't approve at first. Not because Frank was black and Stephanie was white. Conrad had built his fortune in a changing city and knew better than to care about that. It was the money, or the lack of it. He couldn't understand why his brilliant, beautiful daughter would choose a man who would never be able to give her the life Conrad had built for her. But Stephanie didn't care about penthouses and vacation homes. She cared about Frank's heart, the way he talked about those kids like they were his own, the way he stayed up late writing grants to get them winter coats and school supplies. 6 months later, she married him. Conrad walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, finally understanding that his daughter had found something more valuable than everything he owned. She had found purpose. They moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen. Stephanie got pregnant 3 months later. Conrad bought them a house. Not a mansion. Just a 3-bedroom craftsman with a yard where his future grandchild could play. He wanted them close. He wanted to be part of this. And for those 9 months, Conrad felt something he hadn't felt since his wife died. He felt like he had a family again. But God has a way of reminding us that nothing in this life is guaranteed. That happiness can be ripped away in the time it takes a traffic light to change. Frank died on a Tuesday evening in March. A drunk driver ran a red light on Western Avenue and hit Frank's car head-on. He was coming home from work. He had stopped to buy flowers for Stephanie because she'd been feeling tired lately. The pregnancy was hard on her. The flowers were still in the passenger seat when the paramedics arrived. They said Frank died instantly. They said he didn't suffer. Conrad would spend the rest of his life wondering if that was true or just something they tell families to help them sleep at night. Stephanie went into labor 4 days after they buried Frank. The stress, the grief, the weight of losing everything in one moment. Her body couldn't handle it. She delivered a baby girl at Northwestern Memorial Hospital on a Sunday morning. They named her Rosie Thomas Wheeler Cook. Rosie had Frank's eyes and Stephanie's nose, and when the nurses placed her in Stephanie's arms for the first time, Stephanie smiled. It was the first time Conrad had seen her smile since Frank died. She held that baby for 20 minutes. She whispered something Conrad couldn't hear. And then her heart stopped. The doctors tried everything. CPR, defibrillators, medication. But Stephanie was gone. Conrad stood in that hospital room holding a newborn baby girl, staring at his daughter's body, and realized he had lost everything that mattered in less than a week. Conrad was 73 years old, and he didn't know how to take care of a baby. He had nannies when Stephanie was born. His wife handled everything. He went to work, came home, played with his daughter for an hour before bed, and called himself a good father. But now his wife was dead.
His daughter was dead.
His son-in-law was dead. And this tiny, fragile thing that weighed 7 pounds was the only piece of them left. He tried. God knows he tried. He hired a nurse to stay at his penthouse. He bought every baby book he could find. But every time he looked at Rosie, all he saw was Stephanie's face. All he saw was everything he'd lost. The grief was suffocating. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. And he was terrified he was going to break this child the way his life had been broken. That's when Barbara Walker showed up, Frank's older sister. She came to the funeral, stood quietly in the back, and afterward, she approached Conrad with the kind of calm confidence that made people trust her. She told him she understood what he was going through. She told him Rosie needed stability, routine, a mother's touch. She said Conrad's grief was too heavy right now, that maybe the best thing for Rosie was to be raised by family who could give her what she needed without the weight of all that trauma. And Conrad, desperate and drowning, believed her. Barbara had been a legal secretary for 15 years. She knew how to file paperwork, how to navigate the system, how to make things look official. She presented Conrad with guardianship documents, and he signed them without reading them carefully. She assured him it was temporary, just until he got back on his feet. Just until Rosie was old enough that his grief wouldn't frighten her. He would still be part of her life. He would still be her grandfather. He just wouldn't have to carry the weight alone. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like mercy. So Conrad agreed. He set up a trust fund. $10,000 a month. Enough to give Rosie everything she could ever need. Private schools, music lessons, a college fund, vacations. Barbara thanked him with tears in her eyes. She said he was a good man. She said Rosie would never want for anything. For the first 2 years, Barbara sent photos. Rosie in a high chair. Rosie taking her first steps. Rosie dressed up for her first Halloween. The captions were always warm. Rosie's doing great. She's so smart. She asks about you. Conrad believed every word. He sent birthday gifts, Christmas presents, cards with checks inside for extras. Barbara always sent thank you notes. Always signed, with love, Barbara and Rosie. But then the photos stopped coming as frequently. The updates became shorter. And when Conrad asked if he could visit, Barbara always had an excuse. Rosie had a cold. Rosie had a busy schedule. It would be too confusing for her right now. Maybe next month. Conrad told himself it made sense. He told himself Barbara knew what was best. And so he kept sending the checks. Every month. For 18 years. Until November 12th, when everything he believed turned to ash. Conrad's 73rd birthday should have been quiet. Maybe dinner at his club. Maybe a phone call from Rosie wishing him well. She was 18 now. An adult. He'd been planning to reach out, to finally rebuild the relationship Barbara said he needed to wait for. But instead of a card from his granddaughter, he got a visitor. A private investigator named Corey Hawkins. Corey didn't call ahead. He just showed up at Conrad's penthouse at 9 in the morning with a manila folder and the kind of face that said nothing good was about to happen. Conrad almost didn't let him in. But Corey said 3 words that changed everything. It's about Rosie. Conrad opened the door. They sat in the living room, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline gleaming like a postcard behind them. Corey placed the folder on the coffee table and said he'd been hired by a social worker who had questions about a young woman living in a South Side shelter. A young woman named Rosie Wheeler-Cook who had no identification, no social security card, no birth certificate, and no memory of ever having a family. The social worker ran her fingerprints through the system and found a name. Conrad Keene. Listed as her next of kin. Listed as her legal guardian before Barbara Walker took over. The social worker wanted to know why a billionaire's granddaughter was sleeping on a metal cot in a homeless shelter. Conrad's hands started shaking. He asked Corey if he was sure. if maybe this was some kind of mistake. Corey opened the folder. Inside were photographs. Rosie at the shelter. Rosie washing dishes in the kitchen. Rosie sitting alone at a table in the dining hall with a look on her face that Conrad recognized because he'd seen it in the mirror every day since Stephanie died. It was the look of someone who had been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to love them. Corey pulled out another set of documents. Bank records. Barbara Walker's bank records. For 18 years, Conrad had been sending $10,000 a month to an account in Barbara's name, designated for Rosie's care. $2.16 million. Corey's team had tracked every single transaction. Here's what they found. In 2007, Barbara bought a house in Oak Park. A $2.3 million mansion with 5 bedrooms, a 3-car garage, and a heated pool. She paid cash. In 2010, she bought a BMW.
Cash.
In 2013, a Mercedes.
Cash.
Her 2 biological children, Jose Wallace and Sheila Thacker, attended St. Ignatius College Prep, one of the most expensive private schools in Illinois. $45,000 a year per child. They went on vacations to Europe, ski trips to Aspen, summer homes in Wisconsin. Jose graduated from Northwestern University with 0 student debt. Sheila was currently attending Boston College, also debt-free. The bank records showed regular payments to luxury retailers. Williams-Sonoma, Neiman Marcus, Pottery Barn. There were charges for country club memberships, spa visits, fine dining. Barbara Walker was living like royalty. And Rosie? According to Corey's investigation, Rosie had been homeschooled, which meant she'd never attended an actual school. She had no medical records after age 6. No dental records. No documentation of any kind. She'd never been to a doctor, a dentist, or a hospital unless you counted the free clinic near the shelter. Barbara had told people Rosie was being educated privately, but there were no tutors, no curriculum, no records of any kind. And then, on Rosie's 18th birthday, Barbara kicked her out.
Just like that.
No explanation. No money. No identification. Nothing. Rosie ended up at Mercy House, a shelter on the south side, because a woman at a bus stop told her about it. She'd been there for 8 months. Conrad sat in that living room staring at the photographs of his granddaughter, and he realized the truth. Barbara Walker had stolen his money. But worse than that, she had stolen Rosie's entire childhood. She had taken every dollar meant to give Rosie a life and used it to build a kingdom for herself and her own children while Rosie lived in shadows. While Rosie believed she was unwanted. While Rosie thought her grandfather hated her. Corey asked Conrad what he wanted to do. Conrad looked at the photo of Rosie washing dishes, her hair pulled back, her eyes empty, and he said the only thing that made sense. He said, "Take me to her." Mercy House sat on a cracked street in Englewood, surrounded by boarded-up buildings and chain-link fences. It was the kind of place people only ended up when every other door had slammed in their faces. Conrad pulled up in his Mercedes, and he could feel the stares. A white man in a $3,000 suit stepping out of a luxury car in this neighborhood. He looked out of place because he was... Corey walked beside him to the front door. The shelter director, a tired-looking woman named Brenda Caraballo, met them in the lobby. She'd been expecting them. Corey had called ahead. Brenda led them down a narrow hallway to the kitchen. She said Rosie worked there most mornings, helped prepare meals for the residents. She was reliable,
Quiet.
never caused trouble. Brenda said Rosie was one of the good ones. Conrad pushed open the kitchen door and saw her for the first time in 18 years. She was standing at the industrial sink scrubbing a pot, her hair tied back in a ponytail, wearing a donated t-shirt and jeans that were too big for her. She didn't look up when they walked in. Brenda said her name softly. "Rosie, you have visitors." Rosie turned, and Conrad felt his heart stop. She had Stephanie's face. The same eyes. The same nose. The same mouth. She was beautiful, but there was something else. Something hollow. Like she'd learned a long time ago not to expect anything good from strangers. She looked at Conrad and Corey with the kind of suspicion people develop when life keeps hurting them. Brenda introduced them. Said Conrad was a friend of a friend who wanted to talk to her. She didn't say he was her grandfather. Not yet. Rosie wiped her hands on a towel and nodded. She asked if she was in trouble. Conrad's voice cracked when he said no. He asked if they could sit down somewhere and talk. They sat in a small office off the kitchen. Just the three of them. Conrad, Rosie, and Corey. Brenda stayed outside to give them privacy. Conrad didn't know where to start. How do you tell someone that their entire life has been a lie? That the person who raised them had been stealing from them since the day they were born? He decided to start with the truth. He said, "My name is Conrad Keene. I'm your grandfather." Rosie stared at him. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she shook her head. She said, "I don't have a grandfather." Conrad's chest tightened. He said, "Yes, you do. Your mother was my daughter, Stephanie. She died the day you were born." Rosie's face went pale. She said, "I know about my mother. Barbara told me." Conrad asked what Barbara had told her. And that's when Rosie said the words that broke him completely. She said, "Barbara told me my grandfather blamed me for my mother's death. She said he couldn't stand to look at me because I reminded him of what he lost. She said he wanted nothing to do with me." Conrad felt like he'd been punched in the chest. He said, "That's not true. None of that is true." But Rosie didn't believe him. Why would she? She'd spent 18 years being told she was unwanted. Being told she was the reason her mother was dead. Being told she was a burden nobody wanted to carry. Conrad pulled out his phone. He showed her photos of Stephanie. Photos he'd kept on his phone for 18 years because looking at them was the only way he could still feel close to his daughter. Rosie stared at the screen. She touched Stephanie's face with one finger, and her hand was shaking. Conrad said, "Your mother loved you. She held you. She smiled when she saw you. And then her heart gave out. But it wasn't your fault. It was never your fault." Rosie's eyes filled with tears. She asked why Barbara would lie. Conrad said, "Because she was stealing from you. And she needed you to believe you were alone so you wouldn't ask questions." Corey opened his folder and showed Rosie the bank records. The house. The cars. The private schools. The vacations. He showed her the checks Conrad had been sending every month for 18 years. $10,000. Every single month. Meant for her. Rosie's hands were shaking so hard she almost dropped the papers. She said, "I lived in the basement. She didn't let me go upstairs when her friends visited. She said I was an embarrassment." Conrad wanted to reach across the table and hold her, but he didn't know if she'd let him. He said, "You're not an embarrassment. You're my granddaughter. And I'm so sorry I let this happen to you." Rosie looked at him with tears streaming down her face, and she asked the question Conrad had been asking himself since Corey showed him those photos. She said, "Why didn't you come looking for me sooner?" Conrad didn't have a good answer. He could have said he trusted Barbara. He could have said he thought Rosie was happy. He could have said a lot of things. But the truth was simpler and more painful. He said, "I was a coward. I let my grief make me weak, and I let someone take advantage of that weakness. And you paid the price. I can't undo that. But I can make sure you never feel abandoned again." Rosie didn't say anything. She just sat there crying quietly, and Conrad realized this was going to take time. You don't rebuild trust in one conversation. You don't undo 18 years of lies and neglect with an apology. But he had to start somewhere. He asked Rosie if she would let him help her. If she would let him make this right. Rosie looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. The first thing Conrad did was hire a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. Jose Wallace, one of the best fraud attorneys in Chicago. Jose had built his career going after white-collar criminals, and when Conrad explained what Barbara had done, Jose's face went cold. He said this wasn't just theft. This was embezzlement. Fraud. Financial exploitation of a minor. Barbara Walker was looking at serious prison time. But first, they needed documentation. Jose requested all financial records related to the trust fund. Every deposit, every withdrawal, every transaction. He subpoenaed Barbara's bank records, her tax returns, her mortgage documents. He hired a forensic accountant to trace every dollar. It took 3 weeks. When the report came back, it was worse than Conrad had imagined. Barbara Walker had spent $2.16 million on herself and her biological children. She had falsified documents claiming the money was being used for Rosie's education and care. She had forged receipts. She had created fake invoices for tutors who didn't exist, medical expenses that never happened, school fees that were never paid. She had built an entire paper trail of lies to cover up the fact that she had been funneling Conrad's money into her own accounts for nearly 2 decades. The forensic accountant estimated that Rosie had received less than $50,000 over 18 years. And most of that had been spent on basic food and clothing. No birthday parties. No Christmas gifts. No vacations. No college fund. Nothing. Barbara had taken everything meant for Rosie and used it to give her own children the life Rosie should have had. Jose filed a lawsuit.
Fraud.
Embezzlement. Breach of fiduciary duty. He also filed a criminal complaint with the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. Barbara Walker was about to lose everything. But first, Conrad wanted to look her in the eye. He wanted her to know that he knew what she'd done. He wanted her to understand that there were consequences for stealing from a child. So on a cold morning in late November, Conrad, Rosie, Jose, Corey, and 2 police officers drove to Oak Park. To the $2.3 million house Barbara had bought with Conrad's money. The house was exactly what you'd expect. Pristine lawn.
Designer landscaping.
A circular driveway with a fountain in the middle. The kind of place that screamed wealth. Conrad rang the doorbell. It took a minute, but then the door opened. Barbara Walker stood there in yoga pants and a cashmere sweater, her hair perfectly styled, holding a cup of coffee. She looked at Conrad, and her face went white. She said his name like a question. Conrad said, "We need to talk." Barbara's eyes darted to the police officers. She asked what was going on. Jose stepped forward and handed her the lawsuit. He said, "You're being sued for fraud and embezzlement. You're also being charged criminally. I suggest you get a lawyer." Barbara's hands started shaking. She looked at Rosie standing behind Conrad, and for a second, Conrad thought he saw regret on her face. But then Barbara's expression changed. She got angry. She said, "You don't understand. Frank and Stephanie left me with nothing. They didn't care about me. They didn't help me. I had to raise 2 kids on my own while they played house and acted like they were better than everyone." Conrad stared at her. He said, "So, you punished Rosie for it?" Barbara's voice got louder. She said, "Rosie was fine. She had a roof over her head. She had food. She was taken care of." Conrad stepped closer. He said, "She lived in your basement while your kids went to private school. She had no medical care while you got spa treatments. She's been living in a homeless shelter for 8 months while you're drinking expensive coffee in a house I paid for. That's not care. That's cruelty." Barbara started crying. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't mean for it to go this far. She said she'd pay it all back. But it was too late. The police officers arrested her right there on her front porch. They put her in handcuffs, read her rights, and walked her to the squad car. Her neighbors came out to watch. Jose and Sheila Thacker came running out of the house asking what was happening. Barbara screamed at them to call a lawyer. Conrad watched the police car drive away, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like maybe, just maybe, there was still justice left in this world. Barbara Walker's trial lasted 6 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. The forensic accountant testified about the missing money. Bank records showed the purchases. Receipts proved the lies. Barbara's lawyer tried to argue that she'd been under emotional distress after losing her brother, that she'd made mistakes but hadn't meant to hurt anyone.
The jury didn't buy it.
They convicted her on 12 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and financial exploitation of a minor. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in prison. The house was seized. The cars were sold. Every asset Barbara had purchased with Conrad's money was liquidated to pay restitution. But the money didn't matter to Conrad anymore. What mattered was Rosie. The first few months were hard. Rosie moved into Conrad's penthouse, but she didn't know how to live there. She was used to sleeping on a cot, eating in a cafeteria line, working in a kitchen. Suddenly, she had her own bedroom with a view of Lake Michigan. She had a closet full of clothes Conrad bought for her. She had access to anything she wanted, but she didn't know how to want things. She'd spent 18 years being told she didn't deserve anything. Conrad hired a therapist. Dr. Hosea Gonzalez specialized in trauma and family reconciliation. He met with Rosie twice a week, and slowly, piece by piece, she started to heal. She started to believe that maybe she wasn't the burden Barbara had told her she was. Maybe she was allowed to take up space. Maybe she was allowed to be loved. Conrad learned how to be a grandfather. Not the distant man who sent checks and assumed everything was fine. A real grandfather. He made breakfast with her. Eggs and toast. Nothing fancy. He asked about her day. He told her stories about Stephanie. About how Stephanie used to sneak cookies from the kitchen when she thought no one was looking. About how Stephanie had wanted to be a teacher when she was little. About how she met Frank and fell in love. Rosie listened to every word like she was starving for them. And maybe she was. For 18 years, no one had told her where she came from. No one had told her she mattered. Conrad made sure she knew. Every single day. 6 months after Barbara's sentencing, Rosie told Conrad she wanted to go back to school. She'd never graduated high school, never even attended a real school, but she wanted to try. Conrad hired tutors. They worked with Rosie to get her GED. She studied every day.
Math,
Science,
history,
English. Things she should have learned years ago but never had the chance. She took the test in May. She passed. When the results came in the mail, Rosie cried. Not because she was sad. Because for the first time in her life, she'd accomplished something that was hers. Something no one could take away. Conrad asked her what she wanted to do next. Rosie said she wanted to help people. People like her. People who ended up in shelters because the system failed them. She said she wanted to be a social worker. Just like her father. Conrad smiled. He said Stephanie would be proud. They started looking at colleges. Rosie applied to 6 schools. She got accepted to 4. She chose DePaul University because it was close to home and had a strong social work program. Conrad paid for everything. Tuition.
books, housing.
Not because he had to.
Because he wanted to.
Because this was what the money should have been used for all along. But Rosie didn't just take the money and disappear into her new life. She did something that showed Conrad who she really was underneath all the trauma. She asked him to help her start a scholarship fund. A fund for young women aging out of foster care or homeless shelters. Women who needed a second chance but didn't have anyone to give it to them. Conrad said yes. They set up the Stephanie Wheeler Cook Memorial Scholarship Fund. It would provide full tuition, housing, and living expenses to 5 women every year. Women like Rosie. Women who deserved better than what life had given them. The first award ceremony happened in Conrad's penthouse. 5 young women stood in that living room, holding acceptance letters to colleges they never thought they'd be able to attend. Rosie stood next to Conrad and gave a speech. She talked about what it felt like to believe you were unwanted. To believe you were the reason bad things happened. She talked about the shelter. About the nights she went to bed hungry. About the days she wondered if anyone would ever see her as more than a burden. And then she talked about second chances. About how one person caring can change everything. She looked at Conrad when she said it. And Conrad, who hadn't cried in public since Stephanie died, cried. 2 years later, Rosie graduated from DePaul with honors. She got a job at Catholic Charities working with homeless youth. She spent her days doing exactly what her father had done. Fighting for kids nobody else wanted. Helping them find housing, education, hope. Conrad went to her graduation. He sat in the audience with tears in his eyes as Rosie walked across that stage and received her diploma. He thought about Stephanie, about Frank, about how proud they would be of the woman Rosie had become despite everything Barbara had done to break her. Barbara Walker served 8 years of her 12-year sentence before being released on parole. She moved to a small apartment in Indiana. Her children, Jose and Sheila, had cut off all contact with her after the trial. They couldn't forgive her for what she'd done to Rosie. For the lies. For the cruelty. For making them complicit in something so terrible without even knowing it. Jose had paid back every penny of his college tuition to the restitution fund. Sheila had done the same. They wanted no part of the life Barbara had built on Rosie's suffering. Barbara tried to contact Rosie once after her release. She sent a letter, an apology. Rosie read it, and then she threw it away. She told Conrad she didn't need Barbara's apology to move forward. She'd already moved forward without it. Conrad sold his penthouse and bought a house in Lincoln Park. A house with a guest room for Rosie. A house with a yard where maybe, one day, there would be great-grandchildren running around. He was 75 now. His hair was completely white. His hands shook sometimes. But he was happier than he'd been in 18 years. Because he had his granddaughter back. Because he'd learned that it's never too late to do the right thing. That you can't undo the past, but you can change the future. That love, real love, doesn't give up even when it's hard. Even when it hurts. Even when it means admitting you were wrong. Every Sunday, Conrad and Rosie had dinner together. Sometimes at his house. Sometimes at her apartment. They talked about everything. About work. About Rosie's clients. About the scholarship fund. About Stephanie and Frank. About the family they should have been all along. And sometimes, when the conversation got quiet, Conrad would look at Rosie and see the little girl he should have fought for 18 years ago. The little girl he let slip through his fingers because he was too broken to see what was happening right in front of him. He couldn't get those years back. He couldn't undo Barbara's cruelty. He couldn't give Rosie the childhood she deserved. But he could give her the rest of her life. And he could make sure she never, ever felt alone again. This story isn't just about money. It's about trust. It's about how the people we believe in the most can sometimes be the ones who hurt us the worst. Barbara Walker didn't steal $2 million from Conrad Keene. She stole Rosie's childhood. She stole 18 years of memories, birthdays, holidays, and moments that can never be replaced. And she did it while pretending to care. While sending thank you notes. While cashing checks meant to protect the child she was supposed to love. But this story is also about second chances. About a man who realized his mistakes and fought to make them right. About a young woman who survived something that should have destroyed her and used it to help others. About justice that came late, but came anyway. What would you have done in Conrad's place? If you discovered that the person you trusted had been lying to you for 18 years, would you be able to forgive yourself for not knowing? And what would you have done in Rosie's place? If you found out that the grandfather you thought hated you had actually been trying to take care of you all along, could you let go of the anger? Could you rebuild something from the ashes? Let us know in the comments what you think. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about trust and family and the people we hand our hearts to, give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this remind us that even when everything falls apart, even when the people we trusted most betray us, there's still hope. There's still a chance to make things right. There's still time to build something new from the ruins of what was lost. Subscribe so you don't miss our next story. We'll see you soon.